I bought a bunch of the highest rated chef's knives on Amazon to see if they're actually good knives or just cheap garbage, regardless of the positive review count. We're going to do this by testing the knife's specs as well as their performance with edge retention testing, toughness testing, and real world usage. I'm also throwing in a $300 custom and a $170 Wüsthof for comparison purposes. Which one of these knives is the best overall knife and which one is the best value? The answer may surprise you. Oh man, it's not even close. But first, this is not your typical YouTube chef's knife review. We need to get something out of the way. I don't care about the manufacturer's specs or the knife styles. Choosing a knife based off of the manufacturer's specs or style is kind of like taste testing based off of reading the ingredients on the packaging or recipe. It depends on how well these ingredients are put together that actually matters. Now, taste testing in the knife world would include things like hardness testing, geometry, edge retention, sharpenability, or how well the knife re-sharpens after use, how well the knife actually feels to use, and most importantly, how the knife cuts. I also asked another opinion on what should be the most important part of this review, so I asked a fellow YouTube knife reviewer, Erica from Erica's EDC, what she thought was the most important.
Like, at the end of the day, the knife is meant to cut things. For me, the most important thing is that it cuts and it's comfortable in your hand.
So does it cut?
As well as many more questions answered. But first, what knives are we testing? First, in no particular order, is the Mercer Culinary 8-inch chef's knife for about 19 bucks, with about 43,000 reviews. Next, we have the Imarku 8-inch chef's knife for about 30 bucks, with over 16,000 reviews. Next, we have the Babish 8-inch chef's knife for about 27 bucks, with over 10,000 reviews. Next, we have the Wüsthof 8-inch chef's knife for about 170 bucks. This is a little lower on the review count, but still a very popular high-end chef's knife. Next is the Mosfiata, or however you say that, 8-inch chef's knife for about 44 bucks and over 17,000 reviews. Next is the Shanzhou 8-inch chef's knife for about 70 bucks. This is a lesser known knife, but it did very well in one of my previous reviews, so I included it in this test. And last but not least is a custom from Edge Knife Works for about 300 bucks. I did pay for all of these with my own money for this review, except for the custom which was given to me to mess around with for demonstrations like these. And here's a quick and easy way to visualize the difference in price between the knives that we're testing today. I tested all of these knives on my Rockwell hardness tester. Steel hardness is a major contributor to the knife apex toughness and edge retention, something I'll show here in a minute. To simplify this majorly, harder is generally better in all cases, especially when it comes to lower strength applications like chef's knives. Even though hardness is super important, it's not everything, and I'll leave a link to a video I did a couple of years ago explaining this. Now, we have a lot going on here in some of these graphics, but I will give an overview in the end of this video showing all of this at once. Now, a lot of these knives were better than I expected on the HRC testing. However, most of our more super budget options are grouped pretty close together in the mid 50 HRC range, with the higher end options coming in much higher. Now, it's important to note here that HRC testing isn't a linear scale, but it's more of an exponential scale, with a 1-point hardness difference equaling a larger percentage of hardness gain than the previous. So even though some of these knives only look like they are a couple of points higher, this actually equals a significant increase in steel hardness. This is due to the cone-shaped indenter being applied using the same force for each test. Now, we could spend a whole video on this subject alone, but we aren't going to. Sharpness out of the box. Now, this is sort of a useless test, but I did it anyway, which was to see which knife was the sharpest when it was new. Now, to test this, I used a fishing line bite test. Basically, I see how far away each knife will bite into a piece of monofilament 50-pound test fishing line until the knife stops biting into the line. I'll talk more about this test in a minute, and the results were close but apparent. In 7th place, we have the Mercer coming in pretty dull. This was no comparison the dullest factory edge of the test. In 6th, 5th, and 4th, we have the Mosfiata, the Babish, and the Imarku. These were all very close together, and I doubt anybody could actually tell a difference without doing some very fine test work. And tied for second are the Shanzhou and Wüsthof. Both of these came extremely sharp right from the factory. In first place definitely goes to our Edge Knife Works blade, which was absolutely hair-splitting sharp when I got it, and that's why it came in first place. Geometry or behind the edge thickness. How thin a knife is ground has almost everything to do with how easily it cuts stuff. Thin stuff passes through other stuff more easily than thick stuff does. So we measure this by measuring the behind the edge thickness. Now, to measure this accurately, we need to have all of the knives sharpened to the same angle. So I sharpened all of the knives to the lowest angled stock edge, which was 15 degrees per side, and took some measurements. And here are the results. Our top 3 contenders are the Edge Knife Works, the Shanzhou, and surprisingly, the Babish, all at or below about 10 thousandths behind the edge. This is really good. Next is the disappointing Wusthof at around 15 thousandths behind the edge. In my opinion, this is borderline unacceptable for a knife at this price range. This should definitely be closer to the 10 thousandths mark for a good cutting chef's knife. Will the edge retention make up for it? We will see. And last are the rest of the budget options, coming in at around 19 thousandths behind the edge. This is really thick, almost survival knife thick, and that definitely doesn't help in relatively delicate kitchen cutting tasks. Now you may be saying that the thickness on some of these knives is to help keep the knife from catastrophically chipping during hard impacts or cutting tasks. Well, let's see about that with our next test. The brass rod test. The brass rod test is testing the apex toughness by dropping a calibrated 2x4 onto the spine of the knife and measuring the damage after it impacts a small brass rod. As mentioned before, hardness plays a major role here by keeping the apex from deforming. Now, all of the knives are sharpened to the same 15 degrees per side angle for this test, which is quite extreme, I may add. So, how do they perform? In last place, we have the Imarco, sustaining pretty severe damage. While this isn't the softest knife here at 56.5 HRC, I believe combined with some of the other tests later that this is one of the worst steels and heat treatments of the bunch. Next, we have the Mercer at 54.5 HRC, the softest steel of the bunch. However, the apex held up fairly well, coming in very close behind the others in this test. Next, we have the Babish at 55.2 HRC. This knife performed ever so slightly better than the Mercer. However, the steel also has some slightly better qualities than the Mercer, which we'll discuss later. Next, sustaining slightly less damage than the Babish is the Mosfeata. This is actually surprisingly good for 55.8 HRC. Next, we have the Wusthof at 57.5 HRC. To be honest, even though this knife came in third, at $170, I would like to see better, especially when compared to the next knife on the list. The Shanzhou. At about 60 HRC, the apex definitely held up slightly better than the Wusthof, while being about $100 cheaper. This is very impressive results for a $70 knife. Last, we have the Edge Knife Works at 63 HRC, with extremely minimal damage. This could easily be honed out on a fine ceramic rod very quickly on the go, with no need to go back to a stone in order to fix it. Very impressive results. It seems as if sometimes you may actually do get what you pay for. Finally, what I think a lot of you are waiting for. Now, edge retention is a very tricky thing to test. Now, the reason for this is due to how the test is measured. You see, we need some sort of way to measure knife sharpness or dullness as we are cutting whatever it is that we're cutting. The problem here is interpreting what is dull and what is not dull. In the past, in order to test sharpness, I've used everything from the shaving test, the paper towel test, hair whittling test, fishing line test, to specialized sharpness measuring scales, which I no longer have or use. And I've come to the conclusion that there are extreme variables in every test. Personally, I think that the simplest and most effective test out there is the fishing line test. Basically, it involves holding a strand of monofilament 50-pound test fishing line in your fingers and recording the exact moment the edge stops fully biting into the line about a 1/4 inch away from your finger. I know, super scientific. This seems to be a very hit or miss test, meaning that one cut can mean the difference between biting in and skating the line. This is not a test that you try to beat, in a sense where the goal is to try and score as low of a number as possible or as low of a score as possible on some sort of push test, or try to interpret exactly when the knife stops cutting something like paper. It's more of a hard stop rather than an infinite sliding scale of dullness. The reason I like this test is because as the knife gets sharper or duller to the extremes, it becomes more and more difficult to differentiate between the extreme ends of the sharpness or dullness scale. You can kind of visualize this like this, where as the knife gets sharper, sharper, the difference between ultra sharp and ultra sharp gets very difficult to measure, and we don't really have a test we can perform that gives us this type of precision. On the opposite end, as the knife gets duller, it gets harder and harder to determine what is dull depending on the test. The paper test, for instance, has a very large window where the knife will sort of cut paper, but it won't cut it great. So there's this game where the tester has to decide what is or isn't cutting well enough to continue. I think what this line bite test does is test this middle range, where the knife is still pretty sharp when it fails biting into the line, but it's obviously not ultra sharp or ultra dull. I think this test focuses more on this middle range of sharpness rather than the extreme ends. So here's an example of this. We have one knife that immediately bites into the line. You can see how it pulls right up on the line. It immediately bites into it. The next knife does not bite into the line whatsoever. However, on our paper test, it becomes a little bit harder to distinguish between the two knives. Now some may say that they can actually hear the difference, which you can, but back to our chart, as the knife gets duller, it becomes harder and harder to hear or feel this difference. Well, this is the theory anyway, so I went with it. I taped up the knives, exposing about 1 inch of blade length, and cut cardboard until the knives stopped biting into the line. And here are the results. The best performer was the $300 Edge Knife Works, cutting 240 inches of cardboard before it no longer bit into the line. In second place was the $70 Shanzhou, cutting 176 inches. Next was the somewhat disappointing $170 Wusthof, cutting 112 inches before it stopped cutting the line. The last 4 knives cut about the same, with only 16 inches of cardboard or 1 cut separating them, which is probably within the margin of error for this test. Now, on a pure dollar per inch of edge retention value standpoint, I know, the Mercer at $18.74 will give you the best edge retention for your money, and the worst is the Wusthof. However, this chart is somewhat misleading, since in order to achieve the same number of cuts as some of the better edge retention knives, you would have to re-sharpen some of the lower end options in between your cuts. Now we can look at this from a time standpoint, or how much time does it take to make the same 15 cuts as our best performer, including a quick re-stropping or honing in between to maintain the same sharpness standard. And this shows that in a pure testing format, it takes about twice as long to complete the same task as our best performer with the lower end knife options. However, this is on a very small scale, not taking into account the middle of the road knife options, which get cheated somewhat on time based on a re-sharpening they otherwise wouldn't need if we increase the test sample size. So one of the things not talked about a lot in knife reviews is how well or how easily does the knife re-sharpen from a dulled state. Now this has to do with the heat treatment, the hardness, and the steel quality of the steel that these knives are made out of. And basically the better those 3 things are, the steel quality, the heat treatment, and the hardness, the easier it's going to be to re-sharpen or get these knives back to a super sharp state. So rather than this being a completely subjective test and giving my opinion on which one was the easiest to sharpen, I timed myself sharpening each one to hair whittling sharp after dulling each one from a sharpened state on a sharpening stone. And here's the results. Initially, the results look very close, but there's definitely a difference between our times from the good knives to the lower end knives. The lower end knives definitely take a little extra work in order to minimize and remove the burr on both the stone and the strop. Now we could test these things forever, but I don't think we have to, because for me, there's an obvious trend line developing. Have you seen it yet? But before we get into that, we've got to do something. And this is something that you can't really test with pen and paper.
Like at the end of the day, the knife is meant to cut things. For me, the most important thing is that it cuts and it's comfortable in your hand.
That's why I have such a hard time doing these reviews, is because sometimes you just like something and you can't really explain why that is. You're like, oh, this is my favorite, but I don't know why. I know why. At least in this case, because after sharpening and testing and re-sharpening and retesting, cutting everything in sight, both on camera and off, I noticed for actual kitchen tasks, I gravitated towards 3 knives in particular. Now, something I didn't mention at the beginning of this video was I actually already own several of these knives. So yes, I bought duplicates just for this test. And after using all of these knives side by side, there was most definitely a huge difference in actual use. That is crazy. Like, it's crazy how much you can feel the difference. Not even close. So here's my subjective rating. Rating the knives 0 to 100, with 100 being a theoretical perfect score. With the Edge Knife Works scoring 90 out of 100, this is a fantastic knife. Not only is it thin behind the edge, but it's also the only knife of the bunch that's hollow ground, which means it will keep its thinness throughout multiple sharpenings. It just cuts the best here, plain and simple. This is the outlier of the group though, but it does give us a reference for a comparison. Next is the Shanzu. This knife just feels very neutral, and it cuts very, very well. It's super thin and has good food release, which is surprising given its somewhat mirror finish. I think combined with the rest of its results in all of these tests, it's the best overall value here. It's just a fantastic knife for the price. And it looks pretty cool too. Next is the Babish. This knife was surprising since it didn't look very good in most of our other tests. However, in actual use, cutting food, its thin geometry paid big dividends. It just cuts really, really well. It also notably takes a very sharp edge. I think its only downside is its handle. It may not be for everyone, but I really didn't have that big of problems with it. It just has superior cutting performance than most of the other knives here. And that is simply due to its super thin geometry. Next is the disappointing Wüsthof. Unfortunately, despite this knife sharpening very well, getting very sharp, having a great handle and feel, it just doesn't cut that well due to its super thick geometry. Sure, it feels nice, but you'll need that comfort because you'll be gripping this thing harder than you should. Really not a fan of this Wüsthof. It just doesn't cut that well. If this knife was just 10 thousandths behind the edge, it would be in a completely different world. Maybe that's something we'll fix in a later video, but for $170, it's a hard pass for me. Sorry. Next on the list is the Mosfiata. This knife was noticeably better than the last two here, mainly due to its food release. For some reason, nothing seemed to stick to this knife. I don't know if that's because of the pattern on the knife or what it is, but for some reason, nothing stuck. And yes, they were all 20 degrees per side on the bevel. So I scored this slightly higher than the last two, even though in other areas, this knife performed about the same as the last knives here. Now the last two, both the Mercer and the Imarco, just didn't cut that well due to the geometry being super thick and the food sticking to the knife. I would say that they have better edge retention and sharpenability than a $1 knife from the dollar store would, but other than that, the cutting experience isn't a night and day difference. Sure, the handles are a little better than a $1 knife, but at the end of the day, I don't think that I could really tell a difference in a blind cut test between these last two knives and a $1 knife from the dollar store. Now finally, the total results combined, where I combine the subjective rating that I gave the knives with the objective testing to give a clear picture of exactly what's going on. Where lower is better on this chart, we actually have somewhat of a perfect situation where we have a $300 Edge Knife Works as the best expensive option, the $70 Shanzu as a good medium or value price point option, and the $26 Babish as a good super budget option. The only slightly weird thing here was the Wüsthof and the Babish, where the Wüsthof scored significantly higher in the objective testing than the Babish, but in actual use, the thicker geometry on the Wüsthof really was a detriment to its cutting performance. So here we are, all the knives from best to worst. So believe it or not, I had a lot more testing that I didn't include because it was redundant. Now thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.